Stop the world!
And I think there's a clear recognition coming from Australia that the security situation that Australia is facing is increasingly problematic and that new thinking is required. Yeah. That Australia can no longer just focus on defending itself from the northern shore just a few miles off, but it needs to be actively engaged further into the Indo-Pacific and be a constructive contributor to deterrence, to stability in the region.
Welcome to Stop the World, the ASPI podcast on security and international affairs. I'm Olivia Nelson.
And I'm David Rowe.
Welcome back, Ro. It's nice of you to finally come back to the office. How was your holiday?
Yeah, it was ace-live. I had the trifecta of sun, surf and Sangiovese. The Sangiovese, of course, lightly refrigerated because room temperature is a little warm for red wine on the Sunshine Coast.
That all sounds great, Dave, and I'm very, very jealous, but it's great to have you back in the office, and what a week to be back. We've got a treat for our listeners, a conversation on AUKUS with Abe Denmark, who was formerly Senior Advisor to US Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin. Abe was in Australia for the Sydney Dialogue last month and sat down with Justin Bassi for a conversation on all things AUKUS.
Yeah, it's a great conversation with a guest who's been right at the heart of the AUKUS arrangement. He's talking about the need for the partnership, how it came together, and how the three countries, Australia, the US and the UK, can make it work to give us a greater regional stability and security.
I think Pillar 2 grows out of a fundamental recognition that the United States is no longer the sole driver of advanced defense technology in the world, right? And that our allies especially have critical capabilities that they can bring to the table and that would help with deterrence, help with military capabilities.
They also discuss the global strategic environment in which the US and its partners are grappling with the challenge of countering China's aggression in the Indo-Pacific, Iran's destabilization in the Middle East, and Russia's war on Ukraine.
While the United States has not been directly involved in this conflict, I think it's quite supportive of a strategy that reflects the Indo-Pacific as the priority, that China as the pacing threat, while also doing what we need to do to defend Europe, to maintain deterrence vis-a-vis Russia, and to maintain the ability to support our allies and partners in the Middle East as well.
And on the subject of AUKUS, ASPI got a lot of people talking this week with an article on The Strategist about AUKUS and youth engagement. Now, this piece was accompanied by an image which I thought was a really clever play on the Charlie XCX Brat album cover. Liv, as you know, I'm a very current dad, but I asked my girls who Charlie XCX was because I didn't know, of course, and they looked at me like I was an idiot and said, yeah, Dad, of course, we know who she is. I thought I was hip, but this really kind of burst my bubble. If you haven't read the article, I encourage you to check it out. We'll pop the link in your episode notes.
Yeah, Dave, it's all about the Brat summer. Come on. That's more than enough from us. Over to Justin and Abe.
It's great to be joined by Abe Denmark, now a non-resident senior associate with the Asia program at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies and a senior advisor at the Asia Group. And until very recently, senior advisor to Secretary of Defence Lloyd Austin, with responsibility for coordinating the Department of Defence's efforts to implement the AUKUS partnership. Abe, it really is great to have you on the ASPI pod during the Sydney Dialogue sessions. Welcome to Sydney.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Your national security experience is significant. You've spent decades in the American defence system in both the intelligence and security communities. You've recently stepped out and you've taken on roles for the Asia Group and for CSIS, for which, congratulations.
Thanks.
Do you still wake up in the morning and look at your phone and expect to see the President messaging or the Secretary of Defence or the National Security Advisor asking you to do something bright and early?
I do sometimes. It's hard to get out of the habit of being in constant communications. And so much to my wife's chagrin, I'm always have a little bit of an eye to my phone, just seeing if I'm needed or see if something has a message for me. But it's getting better. It's not the first time I've stepped out of this role, so I'm getting used to it. I think more importantly, my wife is getting used to the idea that it takes some time to transition back to the real world.
It definitely is a transition. I definitely thought it was great for me and my family when I stepped away. Not so much for the ego, because I quickly realised that not so many people loved me as I thought. But no, I'm
We all love you. I don't know what you're talking about.
It's nice to hear. A little bit of reassurance is always useful. You still are one of the key people when it came to the establishment of AUKUS, and then, of course, the initial implementation of the partnership. There's an ongoing conversation in Australia about why Australia needed to make that decision, why Australia wanted to head down both a nuclear submarine path and a broader AUKUS path. But for me, the better question, or the more important question, is actually why the United States made the decision, and why after all those years of not sharing such technology since 1958, the only time previously that you'd done so, why did the United States all of a sudden seemingly make a decision that AUKUS and this partnership was necessary?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it wasn't one that was arrived at quickly or without really deep consideration about how this supports American interests. I think it comes down to a couple key facts. First is that the security situation in the Indo-Pacific is growing increasingly complex and challenging due to the rise of Chinese military power and its increasingly assertive approach to international affairs. And second is a recognition that the U.S. allies and partners in the region play an especially critical role in maintaining a free and open Indo-Pacific and a rules-based international order. And so recognizing that Australia needs advanced capabilities, it needs the ability to project power at further ranges than it has been in the past, and that nuclear-powered submarines would be very much in Australia's national interest, but also would make a significant contribution to maintaining stability and deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. I think the logic of it was quite clear. And the fact that AUKUS got endorsed not only by the President, the Secretary of Defense, the defense establishment, but also by Congress, including a Republican-controlled House of Representatives, shows that the logic of this is quite sound from the perspective of American national security interests, but also, I think, very clearly for that of Australia and the United Kingdom as well.
A couple of really important elements there. The wide endorsement and support for AUKUS within the US system is crucial, spreading beyond the current White House and across and through Congress. Also crucial is the reasoning that you set out, that while AUKUS clearly as a pact helps Australian capability individually, what you're saying is that it really helps collectively to assist with the deterrence that is unfortunately needed in the era of not just competition that we're in, but conflict and aggression.
That's right. And I think there's a clear recognition coming from Australia that the security situation that Australia is facing is increasingly problematic and that new thinking is required, that Australia can no longer just focus on defending itself from the northern shore just a few miles off, but it needs to be actively engaged further into the Indo-Pacific and be a constructive contributor to deterrence, to stability in the region. And that AUKUS is a key mechanism in order to acquire this very difficult, very complicated capability.
And there's obviously naturally a focus on AUKUS Pillar 1 at the submarine level, but you've played a very important role in relation to AUKUS Pillar 2 around advanced capabilities. Even at the time that AUKUS was being developed behind the scenes, all three countries, as you know, were looking at Pillar 2 as being just as important as Pillar 1. So Abe, can you take us through where you think Pillar 2 is headed, where it's going to end up? Where is it taking us in terms of our three countries collectively being able to both retain a technological competitive edge and, where necessary, regain it?
Yeah, I think Pillar 2 grows out of a fundamental recognition that the United States is no longer the sole driver of advanced defense technology in the world, right? And that our allies especially have critical capabilities that they can bring to the table and that would help with deterrence, help with military capabilities. And so AUKUS Pillar 2 is a mechanism for these three countries to bring these capabilities together, to bring together our scientists, our industry, our education systems in order to improve our military capabilities collectively. I think the key outcome of this already that I think is so important coming out of Pillar 2 has been reform to ITAR, the U.S. system for export controls of its defense systems. And the fact that we'll have now for what is, I've seen between 70 and 80% of the defense trade between Australia and the United States license-free, I think is creating a largely seamless environment or ecosystem for the transfer of ideas, of technologies between our defense industries, is really going to allow the best of all three countries to come together and build a collective capability that's going to help us maintain our edge in the military sphere going forward for years to come.
You talked there about an ecosystem for the transfer of ideas or technologies. Can you maybe take us through what you mean by that? Clearly, it is important in an era in which partnerships are so vital. Are you meaning that we need to go beyond just the traditional military hardware, the military side of defence? You mentioned the education sector, the scientific sector. Is it about recognising across the three countries that all sectors, government, private and civil society, have a role to play here in what we'd refer to as national defence?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is not a new idea. If you look at the early years of the Cold War, the United States put vast amounts of money into the education system with things like the GI Bill, into domestic infrastructure like the interstate system, the interstate highway system, and into advanced military technologies in things like the space race. So this is not a new idea that the domestic economy feeds into and supports a robust defense capability. The difference, though, is that in the 1950s and 60s, it was the military industry that was developing a lot of these new technologies. But that's changed, and now it's the private sector that's developing a lot of these advanced technologies that the defense industrial base needs to integrate. Things like AI, things like uncrewed systems that are available commercially off the shelf, but can provide real military capabilities like we're seeing in Ukraine right now. So the idea that these are linked is not a radical idea, but what is different here is the idea that we're going to lower the barriers between these three countries so that we can exchange ideas, technologies, capabilities in a much more seamless, open environment, with the idea that that collaboration will raise the capability, raise the capacity of all three countries and help us field a more capable military.
It makes perfect sense, and in particular what you refer to there as an open environment, and clearly an open environment presents great opportunities, and it makes common sense to identify what those opportunities are within an open environment. Can I ask you, on the challenges side to such an environment, you refer to the similarities and differences with the Cold War, and of course a major difference being that what we're seeing now in fields like space is very much a commercial sector-led innovation space rather than a government-led space. Is there also a major difference between now and the Cold War in the form of a lot of the private sector, a lot of the university systems were in the Cold War working effectively for government, for the US government and allies? Now, a lot of the commercial sector in particular is global. And so not necessarily working with a starting mindset of where they are working for our country and democracies, that they're working for themselves in a global environment. Is that an added complexity here, Abe, that we have not only shifted to the commercial sector being the lead innovators, but also in an environment where they're operating in countries that perhaps we wouldn't want to have our defense technology associated with?
Well, I think that's true. I think in the defense sector, one of the reasons AUKUS, the ITAR reform, was created in a way that it was to make sure that Australia and the United Kingdom have developed export control systems that were comparable to that of the United States, so that we're protecting the technology from leaking out of this system, while inside AUKUS it'd be able to be shared more openly. So the idea is that it will have higher levels of protection, and we're incentivizing those higher levels of protection while at the same time increasing more collaboration and communication within the countries.
Yeah, I think what it shows, Abe, is that as much as the open environment is important and the work that's been done on ITARs to ensure that there is a greater ability for the three countries to work together and to transfer technology, which is brilliant, it still requires some form of regulation, that we can't go from having over-regulation to loosening it up so that there is, in effect, anarchy. So there's still a requirement to have a minimal level, at least, of regulation that does offer the protection that is necessary.
That's right. If you think about it in terms of an Excel spreadsheet, heavy lines on the outside, minimal lines on the inside. I think that's the goal for what we're trying to create within the AUKUS relationship.
Very good. So that's the goal within the AUKUS relationship, and a lot of the work that you've done and your counterparts have done is to embed AUKUS and AUKUS Pillar 2 in particular within the three countries. Where do you think AUKUS Pillar 2 itself can go with other countries? Do you see the AUKUS trilateral cooperating with other countries? Or do you envisage a time where there might actually be more than just cooperative arrangements and potentially formal expansion to countries like Japan?
Yeah, I think that there's still a lot of work to do within the trilateral. and adding more countries never makes anything easier. But that being said, I think our other allies and partners in the region, they do bring a lot to the table. So I think looking at things project by project, if a fourth country can bring something to the table that would be answer a need for all four countries, that they'd be able to support that, I think it makes a lot of sense to bring them in. Whether or not you bring them in formally into some sort of club or it's just a project by project piece, I think is less important than to answer the questions of what do they have to bring to the table? How do we make sure that it's done effectively and that it's secure?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And we do have a whole lot of unilateral groupings that are working very effectively right now, where we can identify other countries who can work together because our principles align. The G7, for example, has its G7 Plus mechanism. NATO has the Indo-Pacific 4. Of course, the Quad wants to work with other countries in support of a more stable region, and AUKUS can and should be the same.
That's right.
If we can just move beyond AUKUS, I'd love to get your thoughts on the current strategic environment. For the first time in generations, the US and US allies are effectively fighting on three fronts. We've got war in Europe for the first time since the end of World War II. We've got regional conflict in the Middle East that is at risk of expanding. We have Iran with a series of terrorist proxies. And we've got the tensions in this region, in particular with China in the South China Sea, trying to impose its will on the Philippines. We have constant flyovers and aggression against Taiwan and constant cyber attacks, of course. So there's multiple fronts and technological threats on top of that, amplifying all those threats themselves. We're seeing some debate in both our countries as to how to handle these multiple fronts. Some people in the US are arguing that we have to pick which one of these regions is going to be our priority, or the US's priority. Do you agree with that? Do you think the United States in particular needs to choose whether it's going to prioritize Europe, the Middle East, or the Indo-Pacific? Or do you think that no matter how heavy the burden is, the United States and its partners need to say all three areas have to be our priority and we simply can't take the foot off any of these regions?
I think it's a good question. I would say that we have prioritized. If you look at what the Department of Defense has been saying, is that China is the pacing challenge, right? And China is the only country with both the will and increasingly the capability to significantly revise the international system. And so the United States has been putting a lot of resources, a lot of attention, a lot of focus on ensuring that we have the capabilities, the posture, the relationships necessary to maintain deterrence vis-a-vis China. But that doesn't mean you ignore the rest of the world, right? In fact, I would say that if you look at how the United States has responded to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think it's actually quite supportive of prioritizing China, in that we are pushing back against an authoritarian invasion of Ukraine, and we're using American material and that of our allies, but we're not using American troops. We're not using our allies' troops. And we're imposing significant costs on Russia. Russia has paid a heavy price, both in terms of resources and diplomatically, and in terms of people and their military capabilities, to fight what has so far been a very unsuccessful conflict in Ukraine, while the United States has not been directly involved in this conflict. I think it's quite supportive of a strategy that reflects the Indo-Pacific as the priority, that China as the pacing threat, while also doing what we need to do to defend Europe, to maintain deterrence vis-a-vis Russia, and to maintain the ability to support our allies and partners in the Middle East as well. I watched Secretary Austin deal with these three priorities on a daily basis, and I can say that it's very clear, not only for Secretary Austin, but for President Biden, that China remains the pacing challenge, and that the United States is doing what it needs to do when it comes to maintaining our ability to defend our interests and our allies in the Indo-Pacific.
It's well said. I think we've also seen a new negative development, and probably a necessary wake-up call, in the way that the authoritarian regimes, China and Russia, have increased the work they're doing together, including through their No Limits partnership. China, of course, is the main enabler of Russia's war on Ukraine, but we've also seen and are seeing North Korea and Iran working with Russia too. Importantly, both Russia's war on Ukraine and the way that China is supporting so directly Russia has been a necessary wake-up call for Europe. We know now that Europe better understands that while their priority has got to be Russia, they can't take their eye off China either. And likewise, in the Indo-Pacific, why countries like Australia and Japan are so supportive of Ukraine is, of course, because Ukraine is a sovereign country. But even more importantly for us in this region is because we don't want to see what's happening there in Europe happen here in the Indo-Pacific. So the reality and impact of these authoritarian regimes working together requires us, makes it mandatory that us as democracies, as allies and partners, that we work together across the different regions.
That's a very important point. These are not happening in isolation, right? That what happens in one theater affects the other, right? And so there is, I think, a requirement for the United States to recognize these linkages. Our adversaries certainly do, and to implement a strategy that takes that into account. And I think we have.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it goes beyond the US. Do you think a part of taking all that into account is that countries other than the US need to be more willing to speak up? So to avoid a case where it's largely only the US talking about China's aggression against the Philippines or China's aggression against Japan, its very recent incursions into Japan's territorial airspace, for example, received so little coverage from any regional country or regional friend of Japan. Do you think, Abe, that more countries, including Australia, Japan itself, throughout Europe, need to take a stand to say that where there are breaches of international rules, no matter which country it is, that they're most likely China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, do you think that countries need to come together and show the power of collective responses to avoid a situation where a country like China can say, well, that's just the United States. They're trying to unreasonably contain us and unreasonably, unnecessarily create regional tension. It's just major power competition. Do you think there's power in other countries joining the US in attributing breaches of international rules?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think we are, in that when you see China acting aggressively in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, you see not only the United States, but countries around the region speaking out. I was working in the Department of Defense during the Obama administration when freedom of navigation operations became a big issue. Now it's non-controversial for not only the United States, but for other countries to assert their approach to freedom of navigation in the South China Sea as well. China's assertiveness vis-a-vis the Philippines, Japan, et cetera, is an issue that comes up in every international meeting and several multinational fora around the region, around the world. And Taiwan is an issue that's talked about in Europe. It's an issue that's talked about in Australia much more than it used to be, in Japan much more than it used to be. These issues are getting attention not because of any magnificent statecraft by the United States, but because these countries recognize that what happens in the Indo-Pacific, what happens between China and its neighbors affects them directly, affects their interests directly. And so it's bringing together these countries in shared opposition to Chinese assertiveness. And I think at some point, my hope is that the Chinese government would recognize that their actions are actually undermining their own interests and will pull back and focus more on how they can assert their claims peacefully within the bounds of international law.
Yeah, we can all hope, of course, and I do think you're 100% right that we've got to make sure that we're not the ones that become desensitized to that aggression by the Chinese government, that rather we make it routine that we are going to speak up collectively when there are those breaches of international rules and norms. We could, Abe, talk for a long time on these issues, but I know we've both got to get back into the Sydney Dialogue. So a final question for you, and specifically because we are here at the Sydney Dialogue talking technological advancement and challenges, we do also like to have a discussion not just about the challenges, but try to identify a few solutions as well. So what is it, if anything, that has kept you up at night or that keeps you up at night, not necessarily because there's no solution or that it's out of your or the country's complete control, but it's because there is a problem that we can fix, that we know we can address, but we just haven't quite got there yet?
What actually keeps me up is my 6-year-old. She's still wanting to check on things a few times a night. But I think it's a very good question. I think, I've been studying the PLA for about 20 years now. And I've been concerned about the possibility of a conflict with China for that long, recognizing that the costs and risks associated with that conflict are something that we haven't seen in generations. And it's something that I think would be disastrous for every country involved, every country of the Indo-Pacific. I think we're making good progress in addressing those challenges. I think we're making the right investments, we have the right policies, we're building the right force posture. I think we're moving in a positive direction, not just over the past few years, but I think going back to the Obama administration and the rebalancing, I think was a recognition, and you can see those threads pull through the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and into the Biden administration. So I think we're moving in a good direction, but there is no scenario in which there's a conflict between China and the United States where the costs are not catastrophically high. And so for me, I want to make sure that we're doing everything we can, both to make sure that we maintain the ability to prevail in a conflict, but also to maintain deterrence, to avoid those catastrophes. My goal is that when my kids are in their 20s, they think that I was a nut for focusing on the PLA, because in that time there's so little of a threat, and they're not even on the radar in terms of challenges for the United States. That's my hope, and that it just moves from the radar. And I think to do that, we need to maintain deterrence and make sure that China does not feel that today's the day to break the peace.
Yes, that type of future would be nice, and it's actually a great way to finish. As you describe, any conflict between the US and China would be catastrophic. The issue, of course, to maintain deterrence, we have to ensure that China actually believes the United States and its allies would still be willing to go through with war. The moment China believes that the costs are too high for the US and its partners, well, deterrence will then be lost. And we've seen the impact of that with what's going on in Europe. And that's why investment in defence is so important. Not to create war, but to prepare for it in case it does happen, to be able to defend ourselves, and crucially, to be able to give ourselves the best chance to deter and avoid war. Abe Denmark, it's been great to chat. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here in Sydney. We've had a great time listening to you at the Sydney Dialogue, and I hope the rest of your trip to Australia is excellent, and please do come back many times.
I will. Thank you, Justin.
Fabulous.
Yeah, good to see you.
And that's all we have time for, folks. Thanks for listening.
As always, if you have any feedback, please write to us at podcast@aspi.org.au. Otherwise, we'll be back with another episode next week.